At 9:42 a.m. on July 14, 1944, First Lieutenant Ewald Swanson sat inside the cockpit of a B-17G Flying Fortress called Mizpah while watching black flak clouds burst across the sky above Budapest. He was 24 years old with 17 combat missions completed and no room for mistakes. The Luftwaffe had placed more than 288 mm flak guns around the railway yards below, and every one of them was firing. Swanson B-17 was part of a 60-aircraft formation from the 483rd Bomb Group flying out of Sturparone, Italy. The mission looked simple on paper. Hit the Shell oil refinery and the railway yards in German-controlled Budapest. Disrupt supply lines feeding the Eastern Front. Return home. By July 1944, bomber crews in the 15th Air Force understood the reality. Out of every 10 men who entered a B-17, only 2 were likely to come back. Some would be killed. Some would be captured. Others would vanish without explanation. The formation continued forward through heavy flak. Explosions formed dark bursts that could tear aluminum apart with ease. Mizpah was struck in the tail and then in the wings. Shrapnel ripped through the fuselage, but the bomber held its place in formation. Behind Swanson, the crew stayed at their posts. Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt was in the co-pilot seat. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley operated from the bombardier position in the nose. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson navigated beside him. 8 other crew members were spread throughout the aircraft, including gunners, radio operators, and the flight engineer. Moments from the target, Dudley released the bombs. 2 tons of explosives fell toward the railway yards below. The B-17 rose suddenly as the weight dropped away. Then an 88 mm shell struck the nose. The blast was immediate. The entire front of Mizpah was destroyed. The nose compartment, the bombardier position, the navigator station, the Norden bomb site, and the plexiglass panels were gone. Everything ahead of the cockpit disappeared. Dudley died at once. Henderson also died instantly. The shock wave tore through the rest of the aircraft. The structure that had supported 2 men and heavy equipment no longer existed. The center of gravity shifted sharply to the rear. With no weight in the nose, Mizpah pitched upward into a near-vertical climb. The aircraft began to stall. Swanson saw open sky where his instruments had been. Freezing air at 30,000 feet rushed into the open front. The temperature was 40 degrees below zero. Wind ripped at his flight suit. Blood from the explosion covered the flight deck. Through the empty space where the nose had been, Swanson saw the rest of the formation moving toward the rally point. There was no control column. The yoke had been mounted to the forward structure, and that structure was gone. The instrument panel was also attached to the nose, and it was gone as well. Swanson had no airspeed indicator, no altimeter, and no artificial horizon. He had no clear way to know what the aircraft was doing except by instinct and by watching the horizon through the opening ahead. Yet the control cables remained. Steel cables still ran from the cockpit through the fuselage to the rudder elevators and ailerons. They were exposed and whipping in the wind, but they were unbroken. Swanson forced the nose down. He did not know exactly how. There was nothing solid to push or pull. Somehow the aircraft leveled out. Somehow he guided it back into loose formation. The bomber should not have been flyable. Boeing engineers had designed the B-17 for stability, but no one had planned for flight without a cockpit. No manual explained how to fly without instruments or structure. Only basic physics and determination kept Mizpah in the air. Behind Swanson, the surviving crew members began moving forward. The radio operator and the flight engineer advanced through the aircraft. They saw the exposed cables running through the bomb bay. They felt the violent wind tearing through the fuselage. They understood what was coming next. More than 200 flak guns were still firing. The formation was still deep over enemy territory. Another shell was already on its way toward engine number 2. At 9:44 a.m., a second 88 mm shell hit engine number 2. The right cyclone radial engine exploded into oil and metal fragments. Flames streamed back along the wing. The propeller spun freely for a few seconds and then locked in place. Engine 2 was lost. Mizpah now flew on 3 engines. Airspeed began to drop. The rest of the formation pulled ahead. Without instruments, Swanson could not measure how quickly they were falling behind. Technical Sergeant Frank Menzie, the flight engineer, moved forward from the top turret. He immediately saw the danger. The control cables ran through the fuselage in grouped lines for elevators, rudder and ailerons. Each steel cable was about 3/8 of an inch thick. Under normal conditions they were hidden behind panels and pulleys. Now they were fully exposed. The wind pulled at them with force. Without someone holding the cables steady, the aircraft would become impossible to control. Staff Sergeant George Semelli came forward from the radio compartment. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell followed from the waist gun position. They took positions near the bomb bay where the main cable runs were visible. There was no discussion and no hesitation. The situation required no explanation. Someone had to hold the cables. Someone had to pull them when Swanson needed to control the aircraft. The main issue was coordination. Swanson was seated in what remained of the cockpit about 40 feet forward. The crew was positioned in the bomb bay area. The intercom system had been damaged. Communication was nearly impossible. Swanson tried to move the rudder pedals. Nothing happened. The pedals were still fixed to the floor, but the cables they controlled were now being pushed violently by 300-mile-per-hour wind. He tested the throttles. Engines 1, 3 and 4 responded. That provided limited control. Without command of the flight surfaces, the B-17 would eventually drift out of formation and enter a dive. Another possibility was pitching up again, followed by a stall and spin. Either outcome meant no survival. The crew began pulling the cables by hand. They wrapped the steel lines around their hands to improve grip. The metal was extremely cold. It pressed into their gloves and cut into their palms. When they pulled left on the rudder cable, the nose moved left. When they pulled right, the aircraft followed. The elevator cables worked the same way. Pulling back raised the nose. Letting go caused it to drop. Each movement had to be exact. Too much force caused an overreaction. Too little force caused no response. All of this was done without knowing what Swanson was seeing and without understanding what correction was needed. There were no instruments and no indicators to guide them. Mizpah continued to fall behind the formation. The other B-17s maintained cruising speed and turned southwest toward the Adriatic. Swanson aircraft was slower. The missing nose created heavy drag. The destroyed engine reduced power. The formation could not slow down. Every additional minute over Hungary increased the risk from fighters and flak. Standard procedure required damaged aircraft that could not maintain speed to be left behind. By 9:46 a.m. Mizpah was alone. The formation was first 1 mile ahead and then 2 miles away. Swanson could still see them as dark shapes against the summer sky. The aircraft continued losing altitude at a steady rate. They had crossed the target at 30,000 feet. Then it dropped to 29,000. Then 28,000. The crew continued pulling the cables. Their hands cramped from effort. The cold was severe. Blood flow was reduced by the pressure of the steel against their palms. Still they continued. The fuel status was unknown. The gauges had been lost with the instrument panel. Swanson did not know how much fuel remained in the wings. He did not know how long 3 engines could keep the aircraft in the air. He did not know if they were even flying in the correct direction. Navigation required instruments and charts. It required a navigator who was now dead over Budapest. All Swanson knew was one direction. Southwest. Leave Hungary. Cross Yugoslavia. Reach the Adriatic. Return to Italy. Get home. At that point the crew in the bomb bay began waving urgently toward the rear of the aircraft. Swanson could not turn to look. The wind rushing through the open nose made movement dangerous. If he unbuckled he could be pulled forward and out of the aircraft. He remained strapped in place, focused on the horizon and keeping the wings level. The crew continued waving. Something was wrong in the rear section. It was a new problem beyond the missing nose and the failed engine and the exposed cables. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker, the tail gunner, had been at his position when the nose was destroyed. The tail section was the most isolated area of a B-17. It was a small compartment at the end of the fuselage, reached only by crawling through the waist section. Tucker had felt the explosion. He had felt the aircraft pitch upward and then stabilize. Now he felt something different. The tail structure was flexing. The metal framework that supported the vertical and horizontal stabilizers was moving in ways it should not. The blast had likely caused stress fractures in the fuselage, or shrapnel had weakened key support elements. Either explanation led to the same conclusion. The tail section was starting to fail. If the tail separated, everyone would die instantly. A B-17 without a tail would enter an unrecoverable spin. The aircraft would tumble until it broke apart or struck the ground. There would be no time to escape and no chance to react. The crew in the bomb bay understood the danger. They could see the tail gunner position through the fuselage. They could see the structure shifting, and they had no way to repair it. Mizpah was now at 26,000 feet and still descending while continuing southwest. Swanson estimated they had been flying without a cockpit for 4 minutes, maybe 5. Each second felt extended. The wind noise was overwhelming. The cold pushed through every layer of his flight suit. His hands on the throttles were slowly losing feeling, but the throttles were the only controls still available. Engine power was the only adjustment he could make without help from the crew pulling cables in the bomb bay. Second Lieutenant Paul Burnt, the co-pilot, remained in his seat. His control column was also gone. His instruments were missing, but he stayed alert. He watched the wings. He watched the engines. He scanned the sky for fighters. German Messerschmitt 109 aircraft and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters searched for isolated bombers. A damaged B-17 separated from its formation was an easy target. There was no defensive support from nearby aircraft and no shared protection. It was one crippled bomber losing altitude over enemy territory. For the moment no fighters appeared. The Luftwaffe was either engaged elsewhere or had not detected Mizpah yet. The crew continued pulling the cables. Their timing and coordination slowly improved. When Swanson reduced power on engine 1, the aircraft tried to yaw to the right. The crew responded by pulling the left rudder cable. When he increased power on engine 4, they adjusted again. This was not controlled flight. It was survival through physical effort. 10 men working together to keep 65,000 pounds of aluminum and steel in the air. At 9:50 a.m. Mizpah crossed out of Hungary into Yugoslavia. Swanson did not know this. He had no map and no recognizable landmarks through the open space where the cockpit had been. What he did notice was the change around them. The flak stopped. The black bursts of explosions disappeared. This meant they had left the most heavily defended area. It meant there was a chance. A small chance. That chance depended on how long the tail structure would stay intact. It depended on how long the crew could keep holding the cables. It depended on how long 3 engines could continue to produce enough thrust. The fuel gauges were gone, but Swanson could hear the engines. He could feel their vibration through the airframe. They were still running smoothly. That meant fuel was still flowing. That meant the wing tanks were not empty yet. How much fuel remained could not be determined. B-17 aircraft carried about 2,800 gallons of aviation fuel stored across several tanks. At cruise power, 4 engines used about 200 gallons per hour. They were not flying at cruise power. They were running at maximum continuous power on 3 engines to hold altitude and airspeed. This caused fuel use to rise far beyond normal levels. Swanson made a decision. The choice was direct. He would get the crew out. The aircraft was failing. The tail structure was weakening. The fuel supply was unknown. They were still over enemy-held territory. Every minute in the air increased the risk of complete breakup. If Mizpah came apart at altitude, no one would survive. If the crew could bail out while the aircraft remained controllable, most of them would have a chance. They would be captured. They would spend time in prisoner-of-war camps. They would still be alive. The challenge was execution. Leaving a B-17 required coordination. Standard procedures relied on specific exit points. The bombardier and navigator used the forward escape hatch in the nose, but that hatch no longer existed. The radio operator and other crew members exited through waist gun openings or the rear door. The ball turret gunner had to rotate the turret into position before climbing out. Each man had practiced this many times in training. Training assumed the aircraft was intact. Training assumed the pilot could speak over the intercom. Training assumed there was time to organize an orderly exit. Swanson had none of this. The intercom was gone. He had no way to give an order. He could not coordinate who would exit first or last. He could not leave his seat. The moment he unbuckled, the aircraft would lose control. The crew in the bomb bay would lose reference for which cables to pull. The aircraft would enter a dive or a spin within seconds. Everyone still on board would be killed. At 9:52 a.m. Mizpah was at 24,000 feet. They had been flying without a cockpit for 10 minutes. Swanson's hands were fixed on the throttles. His feet rested on the rudder pedals, even though the pedals were useless without the crew pulling cables 30 feet behind him. Burnt sat still in the co-pilot's seat, watching the horizon, watching the wings, and watching for signs of failure. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say. The wind made speech impossible. The crew in the bomb bay made the decision on their own. They could feel the tail structure bending. They could see stress cracks spreading across the fuselage skin. They knew that staying on board meant death when the aircraft broke apart. One by one they began moving toward the waist gun windows. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell went first. He secured his parachute harness, positioned himself at the opening, and jumped. The slipstream carried him away instantly. Staff Sergeant Charles Kelly followed. Then Staff Sergeant George Simelli, and then Technical Sergeant Frank Mency. Each time a man exited, the aircraft became harder to control. With fewer hands on the cables, control inputs became less precise. The B-17 began to wallow. The wings dipped left and then right. The nose lifted slightly. Swanson adjusted engine power to compensate, but throttle changes alone were not enough. He needed rudder control. He needed elevator input. He needed the crew pulling the cables, but the crew was leaving the aircraft. They had no other choice. It was the only logical decision. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker crawled forward from the tail gunner position. He moved through the narrow passage and entered the waist gun area. The crew positions were empty. The exposed control cables hung loose without hands to guide them. Far ahead he could see the large opening where the nose had been 40 feet forward. He clipped on his parachute and jumped. By 9:54 a.m. 5 men had evacuated. 5 parachutes were descending over Yugoslavia. 5 men would be captured by German forces within hours, but 5 men would survive. That left 5 still on board Mizpah. Swanson remained in the pilot's seat. Burnt stayed in the co-pilot's seat. 3 others were still moving toward the exits. The aircraft was at 22,000 feet and still descending. Control was barely possible and the tail structure was close to complete failure. The remaining crew moved quickly. Staff Sergeant Paul Hish, the waist gunner, exited through the window and his parachute opened cleanly. Staff Sergeant Robert Tucker, another waist gunner, followed moments later. That left 3 men on board. Swanson, Burnt, and one final crew member moving forward from the rear. The aircraft became more unstable. With almost no one pulling the cables, Mizpah responded only to engine power and limited aerodynamic stability. That stability was designed for normal flight conditions, not for an aircraft missing its nose and suffering tail failure. At 9:56 a.m. the last crew member reached the waist gun area, jumped and vanished into the slipstream. Swanson and Burnt were alone. 2 men inside the remains of a B-17 Flying Fortress at 20,000 feet over Yugoslavia. The bomber continued to descend. 3 engines were still operating, but the aircraft was no longer truly controllable. It stayed airborne only through residual stability and the fact that the wings still produced lift. Without crew members on the cables, meaningful control was impossible. Swanson turned his head slightly and met Burnt eyes. No words were spoken. The wind would have drowned them out anyway. The message was clear. Burnt needed to leave. The co-pilot had no controls and no function. If he stayed, he would die when the aircraft finally failed. The only rational option was to bail out while altitude remained and there was still time for a parachute to open. Burnt released his harness. He stood from the co-pilot's seat and carefully moved toward the rear of the flight deck. He reached the waist gun exit. He looked back once more at Swanson. The pilot remained fixed in place with hands on the throttles, eyes forward, holding the aircraft as steady as possible. Burnt climbed through the crawlway behind the cockpit and moved aft. 30 seconds later he jumped. Ewald Swanson was alone. 1 man inside a 65,000-pound bomber at 19,000 feet. The aircraft was descending at roughly 200 feet per minute. It was not a dive, only a steady loss of altitude. The 3 remaining engines provided enough thrust to maintain forward speed but not enough to hold height. The missing nose created extreme drag. The aerodynamic shape was destroyed. The B-17 was now little more than a flying brick with wings. The fuel status was still unknown. The wing tanks could have been nearly full or nearly empty. There was no way to know. The engine sound offered no warning. Wright Cyclone engines ran smoothly until fuel was gone and then stopped without notice. If all 3 engines quit at once, Mizpah would fall straight out of the sky. Swanson estimated his position. They had been flying southwest for about 14 minutes since leaving Budapest. Air speed was likely near 180 miles per hour or possibly less. This meant they had traveled about 40 miles or maybe 45. The border between Hungary and Yugoslavia was around 30 miles from Budapest. This suggested they were probably over Yugoslavia and possibly nearing the mountains or moving toward the Adriatic coast. All of this was only estimation. Without instruments, without maps, and without a navigator, he was flying blind. The question was how long to remain on board. Each minute at the controls gave the crew below more time to move away from the crash location. German patrols would search for a downed bomber. If Swanson could keep Mizpah flying a little longer, the crew descending under parachutes would land farther from where the aircraft finally hit the ground. That distance could decide capture or escape and imprisonment or freedom. Staying on board also increased the risk of dying in the crash. The tail structure continued to flex and the bomber could break apart at any moment. When Swanson finally chose to bail out, he would need to unbuckle, stand up, move through the aircraft, reach an exit and jump. All of this would happen while the B-17 was uncontrolled and possibly entering a fatal spiral. At 9:58 a.m. Swanson made his final choice. He would remain with the aircraft for 2 more minutes. This would give the crew more separation and a better chance. After that he would leave. Swanson kept his hands on the throttles. The 3 Wright Cyclone engines continued their steady sound. Engine 1 on the far left wing. Engine 3 on the right inboard position. Engine 4 on the far right wing. All were operating smoothly and all were using fuel at an unknown rate. The bomber descended through 18,000 feet. At exactly 10 a.m. Swanson released the throttles. He unbuckled his harness. As soon as the straps loosened, the wind pressure tried to pull him forward toward the large opening where the nose had been. He pushed back against the seat and then stood up with care. The aircraft immediately began to pitch. With no one adjusting power and no one correcting motion, Mizpah started a slow roll to the left. Swanson moved quickly toward the rear of the flight deck. He forced himself through the narrow crawlway leading to the bomb bay. Behind him the bomber nose dropped. The control cables hung loose in the bomb bay with no one holding them. No one was keeping the aircraft stable. Swanson felt the B-17 accelerating into a dive. He had about 30 seconds before the angle became too steep, before forces made movement impossible, and before the aircraft entered a spin. He reached the waist gun area. The aluminum floor shook beneath his boots. The wind sound was overwhelming. He grabbed his parachute pack from the rack, clipped it to his harness, and moved toward the window opening. The bomber was now diving not straight down but steep enough that Swanson had to brace against the fuselage to stay upright. He positioned himself at the waist gun window, looked down at the Yugoslav countryside 17,000 feet below, and jumped. The slipstream struck him with full force. The wind spun him sideways. The B-17 rushed past with engine still roaring, already 200 feet away and accelerating downward. Swanson pulled the rip cord. The parachute opened with a sharp jolt that forced the air from his lungs. Then there was quiet. Relative quiet. The engine noise faded as Mizpah continued to fall. Swanson watched the bomber descend. The tail was still attached, but only barely. The rear fuselage bent and flexed under the strain. At 15,000 feet the tail broke away. The forward section of the B-17 pitched almost straight down. It fell for several more seconds and then vanished into a line of trees about 2 miles away. Moments later black smoke rose upward. The fuel tanks ignited on impact. Nothing survived that crash. No one could have lived through it. If Swanson had stayed on board another 30 seconds he would have died. The parachute descent was slow. Swanson drifted southwest with the wind. Below him the Yugoslav landscape showed farms, forests, and small villages. German occupation forces were somewhere below. His crew members were also somewhere below, having jumped earlier. His war was finished. He was about to become a prisoner. The ground approached faster than he expected. He saw trees below and tried to guide the parachute toward open ground. The canopy was not built for precise control. The trees were directly beneath him. He struck the upper branches at about 15 miles per hour. Branches broke. The parachute caught on limbs. Swanson crashed through the foliage and slammed into a thick branch on his left side. He felt his left leg break. The bone snapped between the knee and ankle. Pain surged through his body. He fell another 10 feet and stopped. He was tangled in parachute lines and broken branches about 15 feet above the ground. Blood ran down his leg. His flight suit was torn. Deep cuts covered his left thigh where branches had sliced through cloth and skin. His left leg bent at an unnatural angle. He could not move it. He could not put weight on it. He could not climb down. He hung suspended in the harness, fighting the pain and trying to remain conscious. Below him he heard voices. German voices. Soldiers reached the base of the tree within minutes. They were Wehrmacht infantry from a local occupation unit. They had seen the parachutes and heard the crash. Now they were gathering American air crew. Swanson stayed still in the harness, unable to move or escape. One soldier called up to him. Swanson did not answer. The soldiers discussed how to bring him down. They brought a ladder from a nearby farm. 2 men climbed up and cut the parachute lines. They lowered Swanson carefully to avoid worsening the injury. On the ground they laid him on his back. A German medic arrived and examined the broken leg and the cuts and the blood loss. He applied a temporary splint using wooden boards and cloth. He injected morphine from a medical kit. The pain slowly faded into a dull ache. The medic wrapped the deep wounds and checked for other injuries. The ribs were intact. There was no head injury. He found no signs of internal bleeding. The leg remained the main concern. Without treatment, infection could develop. Without surgery, the bone might heal incorrectly. For now, the medic had done all he could with limited supplies in a forest clearing. The Germans transported Swanson to a local command post and then to a military medical facility. A German doctor examined the leg, confirmed the fracture and set the bone. The process was painful even with morphine. Swanson lost consciousness twice. When he awoke, his leg was in a plaster cast from ankle to hip. Through an interpreter, the doctor explained that the break was clean. The leg would heal, but walking normally would take months. Over the next 3 days, the rest of Mizpah crew was captured. All 8 men who had bailed out were found within a 20-mile area of the crash site. None escaped. The countryside was heavily patrolled. Resistance groups operated in the mountains, but the crew landed in farmland controlled by German forces. One by one they were brought to the same processing center. Swanson saw them arrive. Burnt Kmensi Simonelli Bell Kelly Tucker Hish. All were alive. All had only minor injuries. All were now prisoners of war. They were transported to a camp in Austria. Stalag Luft 4. It was designated for captured Allied air crew. About 10,000 American and British personnel were held there, including pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and engineers. Conditions were harsh but not brutal. Food was limited. Red Cross parcels arrived without regular schedule. The barracks were cold in winter. Medical care was basic. The Germans generally followed Geneva Convention rules for officer prisoners. There were no mass killings and no systematic torture. There was confinement, boredom, and waiting. Swanson's leg healed slowly. He used crutches for 2 months. The cast was removed in September 1944. Physical therapy was simple. He walked the camp perimeter each day to rebuild strength in the injured leg. By October he could walk without help. By November the limp was barely visible. By December his body had recovered, but the war had not ended. The camp stayed locked. Guards watched the fences. Escape attempts were uncommon and usually failed. The Mizpah crew settled into captivity routines. They spoke about the mission and the 88mm shell and the 10 minutes without a cockpit and pulling control cables by hand and watching their bomber fall into the Yugoslav forest. They spoke about Dudley and Henderson, who died at the moment the nose was destroyed, and how close they all came to death. Then they waited. They waited for the war to finish. They waited for freedom. They waited to go home. Winter turned into spring. German forces began moving camps as Soviet armies advanced from the east. Prisoners were marched west in long columns. Conditions worsened. Food became scarce. Some men died during the marches. Others escaped in the confusion. Swanson and his crew stayed together. They moved through Germany as the Third Reich collapsed. On April 30, 1945, American forces reached their column. They were free. 9 months of captivity ended on a dirt road in central Germany. American tanks passed by. Soldiers handed out food, water, and cigarettes. Medical teams checked for illness and injury. The former prisoners were moved to collection points, then to airfields, then back to Italy, and eventually to the United States. The Mizpah crew went home. All 8 survivors. All 8 men who had pulled control cables by hand at 30,000 feet over Budapest. All 8 men who had jumped from a failing bomber and lived. Ewald Swanson returned to civilian life in Michigan. He married, raised a family, and worked quietly for many years. He rarely spoke about July 14, 1944. When asked, he said only that he and the crew had been lucky and that Dudley and Henderson had not. He did not see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a pilot who did his duty under impossible conditions. The Army Air Forces took a different view. Swanson advanced in rank over time and retired as a lieutenant colonel. The recognition reflected a full career of service, not a single mission. Still, that mission remained the defining moment. The 10 minutes without a cockpit. The 10 minutes that should have ended every life on board. The crew stayed in contact. They attended 483rd Bomb Group reunions. They met every few years to remember the war, the missions, and the men who did not return. Their bond did not fade. They survived something that should not have been survivable. They flew a bomber without a nose, without instruments, without a cockpit, and with bare control cables exposed to 300-mile-per-hour wind. They did it through coordination, through resolve, and through refusal to give up. They honored Dudley and Henderson by surviving and by ensuring their loss had meaning. Paul Berndt, the co-pilot, stayed in Michigan near Swanson. They remained friends for life. Frank Remensi returned to his family and seldom spoke about the war. George Simonelli kept photographs from the mission and shared them with his grandchildren many years later, explaining what it meant to pull steel cables while an aircraft failed around you. The others spread across the country, but they remembered. They all remembered. Ewald Swanson died in 2009 at age 89. He lived a full life. He saw the world change. He watched aviation move from propeller bombers to jets to spacecraft. The aircraft he remembered most clearly was Mizpah, the B-17 that lost its nose over Budapest. It flew on borrowed time and crew determination. It showed that human will could push beyond engineering limits. If this story mattered to you, please support sharing it. Each response helps more people learn these histories. Consider subscribing to follow more recovered stories from archives. These are stories of bomber crews who refused to quit when physics said they should. Real people and real courage. Share where you are watching from and whether someone in your family served. Thank you for being here and for keeping these memories alive. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley died instantly when the 88mm shell struck. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson died beside him. They were 23 and 24 years old. They never returned home. The 8 survivors carried their memory through 9 months of captivity and through decades afterward in Michigan and across America. Through this account, their names continue. They deserve remembrance, and you are helping make that happen.